0833. You traveled 2,400 miles on the promise of a respectable marriage, only to be cast off on a windswept platform with $1.40 to your name and a dead husband's pocket watch ticking against your ribs. That was Alina Whitfield's reality until a tall, weather-hardened stranger stepped out of the freight office shadows and said the words that would change everything. "Ma'am, my children have been without a mother for 14 months. I am not asking for romance. I am asking for help." The shrill whistle of the Northern Pacific locomotive cut through the cold September air of 1882 as Alina Whitfield, called Nora by everyone who had ever loved her, stepped down onto the warped wooden planks of Missoula Depot in Montana Territory. Her black mourning dress, once respectable Philadelphia crepe, was wrinkled and dust-streaked from 9 days of hard travel. In her gloved hand, she carried a single carpetbag containing 2 changes of clothes, her late mother's silver hairbrush, and a small leather-bound copy of the Psalms. Tucked against her breastbone beneath her bodice was the only thing of true value she still owned in this world: her husband Thomas's gold pocket watch, the case engraved with 2 intertwined initials and a date now 23 months in the past. The platform smelled of coal smoke, horse manure, and the strange dry sweetness of pine sap drifting down from the surrounding hills. Nora steadied herself against the wooden railing and scanned the crowd of trappers, prospectors, and freight men for the face she knew only from a small daguerreotype tucked into the lining of her bag: Dr. Marcus Holloway. The respectable physician of Missoula who had written her 7 careful letters over the course of 6 months, who had used phrases like "a partnership of mutual understanding" and "the comfort of a learned woman's companionship in this rough country." After Thomas had died of consumption in their narrow boarding-house room, leaving her with nothing but a stack of medical bills that swallowed the small estate her father had left her, Marcus Holloway's proposal had felt like a hand reaching down into a deep well. She had written him plainly. She was 24 years old, a widow without children, educated at the Quaker school on Arch Street, and willing to work hard for a quiet life. He had written back with assurances, and a railway ticket folded inside the envelope. "Mrs. Whitfield." The voice was crisp and clipped, and when Nora turned, she saw him. Marcus Holloway was indeed the man from the picture, narrow-faced, neatly bearded, dressed in a fine charcoal frock coat that looked as if it had been brushed that very morning. But the picture had not captured the cold professional appraisal in his pale blue eyes, the way his gaze moved over her widow's weeds, the way a butcher's gaze moves over a side of beef hanging in a shop window. "Dr. Holloway," she managed a small, grateful smile, "I am so very relieved to finally meet you in person." He did not return the smile. He stood 3 full paces away from her, as if her grief were a contagion he might catch. "Mrs. Whitfield, you wrote that you were a widow. You did not write that you intended to arrive still wearing the trappings of your bereavement." Nora felt her cheeks grow warm. "My husband has been gone these 2 years, sir. I wrote you in my second letter that I observed the customary mourning. I assumed." "You assumed a great deal." His voice was low and cutting, careful not to attract attention from the porters unloading the freight car nearby. "Missoula is a small town, Mrs. Whitfield. I am the only physician within 50 miles. My patients are bankers and the wives of mine owners. They will not accept a wife who arrives looking as though she has been dragged from a Philadelphia graveyard. I have other dresses in my trunk." "Your trunk is not on this platform, madam. I see only that bag." The blood drained from Nora's face. The trunk had been lost in Chicago. She had filled out the claim forms and the freight agent had promised the railway would forward it on the next eastbound. She had written to Marcus from St. Paul explaining all of this. She had asked him in that letter to please be patient with her. "Did you not receive my letter from Minnesota?" she asked quietly. His jaw tightened. He pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket, looked at it, and tucked it back. "I received it, and upon reflection, I have concluded that a respectable physician in a town such as this one cannot afford to marry damaged goods. I am sorry for your difficulties. The station agent will perhaps be able to direct you to a charitable boarding house run by the Methodists. Good day to you, madam." He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, turned on his polished heel, and walked away across the platform without a single look back. Nora stood completely still. The platform sounds, the hiss of the engine venting steam, the shouts of the freight men, the laughter of 2 soldiers carrying their kit bags toward town, receded into a meaningless, distant roar. Damaged goods. She had crossed the continent to be called damaged goods by a man who had written her a letter in July describing the wildflowers in the Bitterroot Valley. She sank slowly onto her carpetbag, her gloved hands trembling in her lap. In the small purse hanging from her wrist, she had exactly $1.40. Not enough for a single night at a respectable hotel. Not enough for a meal and a bed. Certainly not enough for a return ticket to a city where the boarding house had already let her room, and her husband's grave was the only thing waiting. The sun was sliding behind the western ridges, turning the sky a pale washed gold. The men loitering at the far end of the platform, 3 rough fellows in greasy hats who had been watching her since she stepped down, began to drift in her direction. "Ma'am, you cannot remain here after dark." The voice was different this time, deep and even and unhurried but with no warmth in it. Nora looked up. The man standing before her was tall enough that she had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes. He was perhaps 35 years old, clean-shaven in the manner of working cattlemen, his jaw square and shadowed with the day's stubble. He wore a faded leather vest over a homespun shirt, denim trousers worn pale at the knees, and tall boots scuffed almost gray by hard use. His hair was dark brown, cut shorter than was the fashion. His eyes were the color of strong coffee, and they held her gaze with a directness that was neither rude nor kind, but simply unflinching. He smelled of leather, wood smoke, and the clean cold scent of horses. "I am sorry, sir, I saw what Holloway did." His voice was flat. "I was inside the freight office signing for a shipment of horseshoes. The window was open." Nora's face burned with a fresh wave of humiliation. He had witnessed her abandonment. "Then you will understand, sir, that I am not in a fit state for conversation. Holloway has done that to 2 other women in the last 3 years that I know of," the man said. "Mail-order brides from back east. He brings them out, finds some reason to reject them on the platform, and keeps the dowry money the families sent ahead for safekeeping. The marshal cannot prove anything because the women are too ashamed to file a complaint." Nora felt as though the platform had tilted beneath her. She had sent no dowry, she had nothing to send, but the casual revelation of Marcus Holloway's pattern struck her like a slap. "Who are you, sir?" "Silas Hartwell." He did not extend his hand, and she understood at once that this was a kindness, not a discourtesy. He was sparing her the awkwardness of removing her glove on a freezing platform. "I run cattle on a piece of land about a day-and-a-half ride south of here, on the Bitterroot River." He paused, looked down at his boots for a long moment, then looked back up. "Mrs. Whitfield, I am not going to lie to you and tell you I came over here out of Christian feeling. I came over here because my wife Margaret has been in her grave 14 months, and I have 2 boys 8 years old and a baby girl 2 years old, and the housekeeper I hired in June ran off with a freight driver 3 weeks ago. My boys are running half wild. My daughter cries herself to sleep most nights because no one knows how to settle her properly. I cannot read a book of poetry to them, ma'am. I never learned more than my letters and my figures. I need a woman in that house who can do what I cannot." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a silver dollar. He laid it carefully on top of her carpetbag. "That dollar, with what you already have, will buy you a ticket back as far as Bismarck. From there you can wire family or a church for assistance. I am not buying you, Mrs. Whitfield. I am giving you a choice. My wagon is hitched at the livery 1 block south. I leave for home at first light. If you are at the livery when I leave, I will take you to my place, and you will have your own room and 3 meals a day and the wages of a governess. If you are not, you keep the dollar and I will not think less of you for it." He touched the brim of his hat, a different gesture from Marcus Holloway's, this one slow and almost grave, and walked away across the platform toward the dusty street. Nora looked down at the silver dollar gleaming dully on the worn leather of her bag. She looked west, where the last gold light was draining behind the mountains. She looked at the 3 men in greasy hats, now only 20 feet away. She picked up the dollar, picked up her bag, and began walking south. The wagon was a heavy Studebaker pulled by 2 patient bay mares, and for the first 6 hours of the journey, Silas Hartwell did not speak more than 10 words. He had handed her a thick wool blanket without comment when the morning air proved sharper than her shawl could turn, and he had stopped at midday beside a clear stream to let the horses drink, and to share with her a packet of bread, hard cheese, and dried apples wrapped in oilcloth. He ate his portion standing, looking out across the valley, while she sat on the wagon seat and chewed slowly, trying not to weep from sheer exhaustion. The Bitterroot Valley unfolded before them as the wagon rolled south. To the west rose the jagged blue wall of the Bitterroot Mountains, their highest peaks already dusted white from an early storm. To the east lay the gentler Sapphire Range. Between them ran the river itself, broad and cold and bright as hammered steel, edged with cottonwoods turning yellow with the season. Nora had read of such country in the pages of Harper's Magazine back in Philadelphia, but reading had not prepared her for the sheer scale of it, for the way the silence pressed against her ears. On the second morning, as the wagon climbed a long, shallow grade, she finally gathered her courage. "Mr. Hartwell, may I ask about your wife?" The reins tightened in his weathered hands. The mares felt it and slowed. "Margaret," his voice was rough. "Her name was Margaret." "How did she pass, sir? If I am to care for her children, I think I ought to know." "She took a wasting fever in the spring of last year. Dr. Holloway rode out from Missoula every Tuesday for 9 weeks to treat her. She died in June." His voice closed over the last word like a door slamming. "Mr. Hartwell, I am so sorry." "That is all you need to know, Mrs. Whitfield. I would be obliged if you did not raise the subject again in front of the boys." She fell silent. They rode the rest of that day in a quiet that was not quite hostile but was very far from easy. In the late afternoon, the wagon crested a low rise, and the homestead came into view below. It was larger than she had expected, a 2-story clapboard house painted white, with a green-shingled roof and a wide covered porch running the length of the front. A red barn stood off to the east, and a long pole corral held perhaps a dozen horses. But what made her breath catch was the spring. Off to the west of the house, a clear, deep pool of water welled up out of the earth at the base of a small rocky outcrop, ringed with green grass even in late September, and ran off in a small fast creek toward the river. Even from a distance, the water looked impossibly clean, like a piece of cut glass set down in the prairie. "Cold Creek Spring," Silas said, the first thing he had volunteered in hours. "Runs at the same temperature year-round. My grandfather filed the claim on this land in 1862 because of that spring. Best water in the territory." A small figure came running from the porch as the wagon rolled into the yard. Then another. 2 boys, identical in every visible particular, same straw-pale hair, same blue eyes, same patched gray trousers, pulled up short at the porch rail and stared. A heavy-set older woman in a calico apron came out of the front door holding a small child on her hip. The child, a little girl with a tangle of dark curls, was sucking her thumb and clutching a rag doll missing one button eye. "Thomas, Henry, this is Mrs. Whitfield. She's going to be staying with us and helping to keep house and to teach you your letters and your sums." Silas swung down from the wagon and lifted Nora's carpetbag with one hand. "Mrs. Whitfield, the boys are Thomas and Henry. The little one is Ruth. The woman on the porch is Mrs. Doone, who has been coming 3 days a week since the last housekeeper left. She will be going back to her own family in town now that you are here." The twins did not speak. They looked at her with identical narrow blue eyes. "She doesn't look," said the one on the left. "Like Mama at all," finished the one on the right. Nora crouched down slowly in the dust, careful of her skirts. "You are quite right. I do not look like your Mama, and I will never try to. My name is Mrs. Whitfield, but I would be very pleased if you would call me Miss Nora. I am from a city called Philadelphia, which is very far away to the east, and I cannot ride a horse, and I am rather afraid of cows. But I make a very good apple cake, and I know every word of every poem Mr. Longfellow ever wrote. Perhaps we can learn from one another." The boys exchanged a single fast glance. They did not smile, but they did not run either. Little Ruth, on the housekeeper's hip, lifted her head, took her thumb out of her mouth, and held out the one-eyed rag doll toward Nora like an offering. The house was beautiful and it was sad. Nora understood this within an hour of crossing the threshold. The rooms were spacious and well built, the floors of broad pine boards, the windows large and clean. But there were small wrong things everywhere. A child's mitten lying on a windowsill in late September as if waiting for someone to come back and put it on. A woman's brown shawl folded on the back of a rocking chair beside the fireplace, the wool gone slightly stiff with disuse. A row of small ceramic jars on a kitchen shelf labeled in a careful feminine hand: lavender, chamomile, peppermint, comfrey, half of them empty. And in the small back parlor that Silas called the writing room, a heavy oak chest set against the wall beneath the window. It was bound in iron straps, and it was secured by 3 different padlocks of 3 different makes. Beside it on a low shelf sat a worn black Bible, its leather cover soft from handling, a faded blue silk ribbon marking a page somewhere near the middle. Nora did not touch either of these things, but she noticed them. The first 3 weeks tested every reserve of strength she possessed. She had been a governess and a wife in narrow city rooms. She had never run a household of 5 people on a frontier ranch. She rose before dawn to start the stove. She learned to bake bread in a cast-iron Dutch oven set in the hot coals. She washed clothes in a copper boiler on the back porch, her hands going red and raw in the alkaline water. She fed chickens. She gathered eggs. She scrubbed the wide pine floors on her hands and knees. She read aloud to the twins each evening from a thin volume of Mr. Hawthorne's Tales for Children, and she rocked little Ruth to sleep with the lullabies her own mother had once sung to her in Philadelphia long ago. The twins resisted her at first with the cold, patient hostility that only children of grief can muster. They refused her cooking for 2 days, then ate it in silence. They refused to take their lessons at the kitchen table, then sat down and worked their sums when she set out fresh molasses cookies as a reward. Henry, she learned to tell them apart by a small crescent scar on his left temple from a fall against a stove edge, was the first to laugh at one of her stories. Thomas was the last to surrender, but on the morning of her 16th day at the homestead, she found him sitting on the porch rail before breakfast, waiting to ask her how to spell the word Appaloosa. Silas she saw mostly at supper and again briefly at evening prayers. He was gone before sunrise most days, riding out to check fences or move cattle to the upper pastures, and he came back at dusk smelling of saddle leather and dust. He spoke courteously to her and gave her the small wage he had promised in silver coins each Saturday evening, but he kept a careful distance, never sitting beside her on the porch, never lingering in a doorway, never permitting himself a smile that lasted longer than 2 seconds. She caught him watching her, though. Twice she looked up from a task and found his dark eyes on her, and twice he glanced away as if she had touched a bruise. On her 22nd day, she broke her mother's silver hairbrush. The handle had been cracked for years. It finally gave way as she was working a tangle out of Ruth's curls. Nora sat down on the edge of her narrow bed and wept for 10 full minutes, not for the brush exactly, but for everything the brush had stood for, the last small piece of Philadelphia she had carried west. The next evening at supper, Silas set something beside her plate without comment. It was a wooden comb, carved from a single piece of pale honey-colored maple, the teeth fine and smooth, the back inlaid with a small darker design of 3 intertwined leaves. The work was patient and skilled. It must have taken him hours by lamplight. "I noticed your brush had come apart," he said, not meeting her eyes. "A woman ought to have something to set her hair with." "Mr. Hartwell." "It is nothing, Mrs. Whitfield. Pass me the salt, please." Henry, sitting across the table, looked at his father, looked at Nora, and then bent very studiously over his plate of stew to hide a small private smile. The storm came on the night of October the 12th. It rolled down out of the Bitterroots without warning, a hard, cold autumn rain that turned to sleet against the windows and made the cottonwoods groan in the dark. Ruth, who had always been a difficult sleeper, woke screaming at the thunder. Nora carried the little girl down to the front room and settled with her in the rocking chair beside the fireplace, where Silas had built up the fire against the chill. The twins came down the stairs in their nightshirts and curled together on the braided rug at her feet, neither of them quite admitting they were frightened. Silas sat in the wing chair on the opposite side of the hearth, a half-drunk cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. The firelight moved across his face and showed her, for the first time clearly, how much grief he still carried in the set of his shoulders. "Mr. Hartwell." She kept her voice low because Ruth had finally settled against her shoulder and was breathing the slow, soft breath of sleep. "May I ask you something?" He looked at her over the rim of the cup. He nodded once. "The chest in the back parlor, with the 3 locks, was it Margaret's?" The cup stilled in his hand. "It was." "Why 3 locks, Silas?" She had not used his given name before. The word seemed to land between them like a small stone dropped into still water. He set the cup down on the table beside him, very carefully. "Because I could not bear to open it after she was gone. I put 2 more locks on it the week after the funeral, and I gave the 3 keys to 3 different people in 3 different towns. The lawyer in Missoula, the minister in Hamilton, my brother in Butte, so that I could not, in a weak hour, sit down and read her letters and her diary and undo myself entirely." He looked into the fire. "I told myself I would send for the keys when the children were grown, when I could read her words without it killing me." "What did the doctor say killed her?" A long silence. "Wasting fever. He said it sometimes comes on a woman after a hard winter. He said there was nothing to be done. He rode out every Tuesday for 9 weeks to bring her tonics. He sat at her bedside and held my hand at the end." His voice cracked, finally, on the last word. He would not take payment for the last 4 visits. He said it was his Christian duty. Nora's arms tightened around the sleeping child on her shoulder. A cold thread was beginning to wind itself through her chest, but she kept her face very still. "Silas, I am so sorry." He bent forward, his elbows on his knees, and pressed his palms hard against his eyes. His shoulders began to shake. Henry, on the rug, sat up and crawled across to lean against his father's leg. Thomas crawled after him and laid a small hand on his father's knee. And Nora, holding the baby with one arm, reached across the small distance between the 2 chairs and laid her own hand over Silas's where it rested on the chair arm. He turned his hand under hers and closed his rough fingers around her own, and he wept silently into his other palm for a long time, while the sleet ticked against the window and the fire burned low. When at last he lifted his head, he did not let go of her hand. "I have not cried for her since the day we buried her," he said hoarsely. "I did not think I had any tears left." "Grief is not water, Silas. It does not run dry, it waits." He looked at her then, and she saw something break open in his eyes. Not joy, not yet, but a thin, pale light where there had been only closed darkness. October bled into a soft, golden Indian summer, and the homestead seemed to exhale. Nora woke in the mornings to the sound of the twins arguing cheerfully over who would feed the chickens. Ruth toddled to her at breakfast each day and lifted her arms to be picked up, calling her Miss Nor, because she could not quite manage the second syllable. Silas began lingering at the supper table after the children were in bed, and they would sit across from one another by lamplight, and he would tell her about the cattle, and she would tell him about Philadelphia, and twice his hand brushed hers as she passed him the coffee pot, and neither of them pulled back. On a warm October evening, he found her on the porch after the children were asleep. The sky over the Bitterroots was a deep-washed violet, and the first stars were coming out. Nora. Yes, Silas. I did not think I would feel hope again in this life. I want you to know that. She did not answer. She reached out and took his hand where it rested on the porch rail, and they stood like that for a long time, watching the stars come out one by one over the valley. It was 3 nights later, after she had tucked the children in and Silas had gone out to check on a mare that was due to foal, that she went looking for ink. Her own bottle had run dry, and she wanted to begin a letter to her late husband's sister in Philadelphia, to tell her at last where she was, and that she was well. She remembered seeing a small ink pot on the shelf in the back parlor, beside the old Bible. The lamplight was poor and she had to kneel to reach behind the shelf. As she did, her knee came down on a pine floorboard that gave slightly under her weight with a small dry creak. She froze. She set the lamp down and pressed the board again. It rocked beneath her hand, loose at one end. She lifted it. In the shallow, dusty space beneath the floor lay the old Bible from the shelf. She had not realized until that moment that the one on the shelf was a different book, set out to disguise the absence of this one. The leather cover of the hidden Bible was worn almost through at the corners. Tucked inside the front cover, between the boards and the end paper, was a folded paper. Nora drew it out with shaking fingers. The paper was a single sheet, brittle and yellowed at the edges, covered on both sides in a woman's careful handwriting that had grown progressively weaker toward the bottom of the second side. The ink was uneven, blotted in places as if by tears or by an unsteady hand. To whoever finds this letter, it began. My name is Margaret Ann Hartwell, and I am dying. I do not believe I am dying of fever. For 7 weeks now, Dr. Marcus Holloway of Missoula has been bringing me a bitter tonic he says will restore me. 3 weeks ago, I began to suspect the tonic was making me worse, not better. I poured a small portion of it into a saucer last Tuesday and set it on the back step for the barn cat, who is a healthy young animal. The cat was dead by morning. I have not drunk the tonic since, but I am too weak to recover. I write this in case I cannot speak it before the end. Dr. Holloway has visited my husband 3 times to discuss what he calls a generous offer from a company in Missoula that wishes to purchase the water rights to Cold Creek Spring for the bottling of mineral water. My husband has refused. I believe the doctor means to have those rights one way or another. Whoever finds this letter, I beg you, protect my children. Protect Silas. Tell him I knew at the end and I forgave him for trusting the wrong man. The fault is not his. The fault was never his. Margaret Ann Hartwell, this 4th day of June, 1881. Nora sat back on her heels. The room had gone very cold. Her hand, holding the letter, was trembling so badly the paper rattled. She heard the front door open. She heard Silas's boots in the front hall. She rose with the letter in her hand and went to meet him. She did not have the chance to show him the letter that night. He was exhausted from a difficult foaling, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold, and he asked her in a hoarse voice if she would please just heat him some coffee and a bowl of the leftover stew so he could eat and fall into bed. She did. She tucked the letter into the pocket of her apron and she fed him, and she watched him climb the stairs, and she lay awake in her own narrow bed the entire night with the paper folded against her heart. She would tell him in the morning. She would tell him at first light, before the children came down, and together they would ride into Missoula and lay the letter before the territorial marshal, and Margaret's name would be cleared and her killer brought to law. But morning came earlier than she expected, and not in the way she had planned. She was at the kitchen stove starting the coffee when she heard the dogs in the yard begin to bark, not their usual barking at a coyote or a passing rider, but the high, frantic warning that meant strangers in the dooryard. She set down the coffee pot and went to the front window. 3 men on horseback had drawn up before the porch in the gray dawn light. 2 of them she did not know, rough men in long oilskin coats with revolvers low on their hips. The third man, dismounting now in a charcoal frock coat brushed clean against the trail dust, was Dr. Marcus Holloway. Nora stepped back from the window. Her mind worked very quickly and very clearly, the way it sometimes had during Thomas's last weeks when there had been no one else to make the hard decisions. She walked, not ran, to the foot of the stairs. "Thomas Henry, bring Ruth and come down here right now, very quietly." The twins appeared at the top of the stairs in their nightshirts, Henry carrying the sleepy 2-year-old. Their eyes were wide. She did not have to explain. They had grown up on this frontier and they had been through one tragedy already. They knew the sound of trouble in an adult voice. She led them through the kitchen and lifted the heavy iron ring set into the floor by the pantry. The root cellar stairs went down into cool darkness. "You will go down. You will not come up until I or your father comes to fetch you. Do you understand me? Not for any voice you do not know, not for any reason at all." "Miss Nora," Henry whispered. "Down, my brave boy. Take care of your brother and your sister." She closed the cellar door behind them and dragged the heavy pine kitchen table over it to disguise the seam. Then she went to the wall above the front room mantel and took down Silas's Colt revolver from its pegs. The gun was heavier than she had expected. She had fired a smaller pistol exactly twice in her life, at her late husband's insistence one Sunday afternoon in a Philadelphia shooting club. She checked the cylinder with shaking fingers. 6 brass casings. 6 rounds. She heard boots on the porch. She heard the front door open without a knock. "Mrs. Whitfield." Marcus Holloway's voice was light and almost amused. "How utterly unexpected to find you here. I confess I had assumed by now you would be working as a scullery maid in some Methodist boarding house." She stepped out of the front room into the hall with the revolver held in both hands, the barrel level and steady against every screaming instinct of her body. "Dr. Holloway, you will leave this house now." He stopped in the front hall and looked at her, and he smiled. The 2 hired men behind him in the doorway did not draw their guns, but their hands rested lightly on the butts. "Mrs. Whitfield, I see I underestimated you on the platform. A widow with backbone, how charming." He took a small step forward. "I have come to discuss a business matter with Mr. Hartwell concerning the water rights to Cold Creek Spring. I have brought a generous offer in writing. I would suggest you put down that revolver before you hurt yourself with it. I know what you did to Margaret Hartwell." He stopped. The smile did not leave his face, but the muscles around his eyes changed very slightly. "I do not know what you mean." "I have her letter, Dr. Holloway, in her own hand, describing the tonic, describing the cat in the saucer, describing your visits to discuss the water rights. I have read it 3 times since last evening. It is in a safe place where you will not find it." The color drained from his face in a slow tide. The 2 men behind him glanced at one another. "Mrs. Whitfield, that letter, if it exists, is the rambling of a fevered, dying woman. It is the testimony of a poisoned woman who knew exactly what was being done to her and who left a record of it. And I am going to see it placed before the territorial marshal in Missoula by this evening." His face hardened. He took another step toward her. "You will hand me that letter, madam, or my associates and I will tear this house apart until we find it. And the children, I am afraid, will be—" The kitchen door at the back of the hall banged open. Silas Hartwell stood in the doorway in his work shirt, a horse whip uncoiled in his left hand, and a Winchester rifle held one-handed at his right hip with the barrel pointed at the floor. His eyes were not the eyes Nora had come to know over the last 7 weeks. They were the eyes of a man who had just heard, through an open kitchen window, every word of what had been spoken in his own front hall. The 2 hired men went for their revolvers. They did not clear the holsters. Silas brought the Winchester up in one smooth motion and fired a single round into the doorframe 6 inches above the nearer man's head, and the crack of it in the closed hallway was so enormous that the man dropped his half-drawn pistol and threw both hands into the air. The second man did the same a half-second later. Silas walked down the hallway slowly, the rifle now held in both hands, and he stopped in front of Dr. Marcus Holloway, and he laid the rifle carefully against the wall. He picked up the horsewhip in his right hand. "Silas," Nora's voice was very calm, though her arms ached from holding the revolver. "Silas, listen to me." He did not look at her. He was looking at Holloway, and the look in his face was something Nora hoped she would never see again on the face of a man she loved. "You poisoned my Margaret, you sat in my front room, you held my hand." "Mr. Hartwell, this is a misunderstanding." "Silas, look at me." Nora took one step forward, the revolver lowered now, her voice steady. "Look at me, Silas Hartwell. If you kill him here in this hallway, you will hang for it. The boys will lose you the way they lost their mother. Ruth will not remember you, and Margaret's name will never be cleared in the public record because there will be no trial. He must hang in Missoula in front of the whole territory, Silas. He must hang for what he did to her by her name in the open light. That is the only way she gets justice. That is the only way the boys grow up knowing their mother was murdered and avenged by the law and not by their father's private hand." Silas's chest was heaving. The whip trembled in his fist. "Margaret forgave you, Silas. She wrote it in the letter. She said the fault was never yours. She said she knew at the end, and she forgave you for trusting the wrong man. Do not become the wrong man yourself. Not today. Not in front of these children who are in that cellar listening to every sound in this house." For a long moment, the only sound in the hallway was Silas's breathing. Then his arm came down, the whip uncoiled to the floor. "Get the rope from the barn," he said hoarsely to Nora, his eyes still fixed on Holloway. "We will tie all 3 of them in the wagon. I will drive them into Missoula myself." The territorial marshal in Missoula was a gray-haired man named Ezra Bain, who had known Margaret Hartwell since she was a girl. He read her letter twice in his small office above the freight depot, and then he set it down on his desk and looked up at Silas and Nora with eyes that had gone wet at the corners. "I will see him hanged," he said quietly. "On my badge and my mother's grave, ma'am, I will see him hanged." Marcus Holloway was tried in the territorial court the following March. The letter was entered into evidence. A chemist from Helena testified that the residue in 2 of the small ceramic jars from Margaret Hartwell's kitchen shelf, the lavender and the chamomile, contained measurable quantities of arsenic trioxide. The 2 hired men, when promised lesser sentences, gave testimony that the doctor had paid them on 2 prior occasions to intimidate Bitterroot Valley homesteaders into selling water rights cheap to a Missoula bottling concern in which he held a silent interest. Holloway was hanged on the 11th of April, 1883, in the public square of Missoula at 10 o'clock in the morning. Silas Hartwell did not attend. He stayed at the homestead with his children and with Nora, and they sat together on the porch in the spring sunshine, and they did not speak of it. That evening, after supper, Nora carried little Ruth upstairs to bed, and the twins followed her up to be tucked in. She heard their prayers, and she kissed each of them on the forehead, Henry first, because she had learned that Henry liked to be first, and Thomas second, because she had learned that Thomas liked to be last. She was at the door with the lamp when Henry's small voice came from the dark. "Good night, Mama." Nora stopped. She turned slowly. Both boys were sitting up in their beds, and Henry's small chin was lifted, and his blue eyes were shining wet in the lamplight. Thomas, in the bed beside his brother, did not finish Henry's sentence the way he had finished 1,000 sentences before. He drew his own breath, and he spoke his own words, the first sentence in 8 years he had spoken without his brother's lead. "We love you, Mama." Nora set the lamp down on the dresser because her hands had begun to shake, and she crossed the room and she gathered both boys into her arms at once, and she held them while the tears came, and she did not try to stop them. Behind her in the doorway, Silas Hartwell stood with one hand braced against the frame and the other pressed flat against his chest, as if to hold his heart inside it. "I told you on the platform that I was not asking for romance," he said softly, when at last she rose and came to him in the doorway. "I would like to ask for it now, Nora, if you would let me." She lifted her hand and laid her palm against his clean-shaven jaw, the jaw she had watched soften over 7 months from a stone to a living thing. "Silas Hartwell, I crossed 2,400 miles to be called damaged goods on a railway platform. And I would cross them again tomorrow, knowing what I know now, because every mile of them led me to this doorway." He bent his head and rested his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a long time, while behind them in the lamplight 2 small boys watched their new mother and their father, and a sleeping baby in the next room dreamed whatever dreams 2-year-olds dream when the house at last is whole. The mountains were rarely kind to fragile things, but some things, once they had been broken and patiently mended, were no longer fragile at all. Did Nora's quiet courage and Silas Hartwell's slow road back to trust find a place in your heart tonight? The American frontier was built by ordinary men and women who learned the hardest lesson of all, that knowledge can save what a gun cannot, and that the truth, even buried under 3 padlocks and a loose floorboard, will always find a way back into the light. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a story about courage and second chances, and subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life frontier dramas every week. Until next time, friends, keep your lamps lit and your hearts open.